Very much. I've titled my presentation Opportunities and Challenges for Authors in a Dynamic Publishing Industry. And I only have 10 minutes, but the question that I'd like us to focus on today is, how can authors make money from creativity without selling themselves? I'll briefly talk a little bit about the current state of the publishing industry. I'll touch up on some of the challenges and opportunities that exist for authors, and I'll conclude with some action points. So, when we think about the question, how can an author make money from their creativity without selling themselves? Well, what is an author's commodity? What can they trade in? It's the intellectual property that is vested in their work. It's the copyright in their work. And the vehicle through which they can exploit this commodity is the contract. So essentially, an author's ability to make money from the creativity of their work will depend on the contractual terms through which they exploit their copyright. And in this context, selling yourself can be taken to mean being shortchanged for the copyright when you contract with someone who is exploiting your rights. So what is the current state of the publishing industry? As all creative industries, it has faced a number of changes post-digitization. The first one is, of course, that we've seen the emergence of new formats and media for the enjoyment of literary works. Think primarily of the e-reader and e-books. And along with this, we've also seen a lot of new players enter traditional value chains, perhaps most notably online retail giants like Amazon. But there's actually a very wide spectrum of intermediaries and platforms that offer various types of services that bridge the gap between a draft manuscript and the final ebook. I've listed a couple of them on the slides, but there's many more: Lulu, Smashwords, BookBaby, and others. And of course, another opportunity that emerges as a result of these new players and new technologies is the fact that we now have an alternative business models that authors can avail of. I'm speaking about self-publishing. However, all these changes have also brought about some challenges for authors in being able to make money. One is that traditional publishers have seen their position as threatened because they suddenly face a lot more competition. Authors now have a direct link with their readership, and there's also more distribution networks, so therefore they no longer have the stronghold over bringing creative works to the market. And this has resulted in publishers engaging in a practice known as banking rights for the future, which has made contract terms even more unreasonable. For research that I conducted with funding by the UK Centre for Copyright and New Business Models in the Creative Economy, I worked with organizations that represent authors. So I worked with the Society of Authors, which is a trade union, the Writers Guild of Great Britain, and the Authors Licensing and Collecting Society. And I've picked a quote here by one of my interviewees from ALCS who tries to summarize, and I think succeeds quite nicely, why publishers engage in what is essentially demanding from authors excessively wide licenses without any reciprocal obligations to exploit the different rights that they receive, which means that creators are hindered from being able to get money through various channels for which their rights are being utilized. A further challenge is that, of course, we have unequal bargaining power when we consider authors on the one hand and publishers on the other. So the common type of contract is a standard terms contract that publishers offer to authors on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. And there is very little leeway for authors, especially those who are not super high-earning authors, to be able to negotiate better payment or more control over the way that their work is used. And finally, another challenge that makes the above two even worse is the fact that the law simply doesn't provide sufficient provisions that can regulate these issues and that can support authors in their weaker bargaining power. If we think, for instance, in particular, the main principle that guides the contractual relationship is freedom of contract, and there are insufficient restrictions on this to safeguard the position of authors. Particularly in UK law, there are no limitations for transferring rights in terms of scope or duration or geographical extent. It's possible to transfer rights for future works as well as for unknown forms of exploitation. But it's not, let me just see how I'm doing for time. It's not all bad. There are also opportunities for authors, and the first one is really to appreciate self-publishing as a real viable alternative to traditional publishing. It not only has the benefit of more speed in bringing a work to the market, but it also means that an author can have more freedom and control over the final product of their work. And in fact, authors can get a lot of support if they decide to take the step and try their luck through self-publishing from professional associations that represent them and from authors. The organizations that I worked with, they offer on a regular basis training sessions, workshops on how an author can approach, how they should promote their work, what it takes to make it with self-publishing. And however, when I spoke to the chief executive officer of the Society of Authors and I asked, well, what do you advise your members? You have traditional publishing and you have self-publishing. Her answer was, well, she says, we say to authors, you think about where you go, but we would still say, actually, you probably do want publishers because they still add value to the work and especially to its promotion later on. And yet, what self-publishing offers is a possibility to test the book on the market. Nowadays, the internet provides opportunities for the readership to be able to assess the quality of the work irrespective of whether it's traditionally published or self-published, for instance, through review sites like goodreads.com. And publishers are increasingly looking at these websites and skimming because based on the reviews, they have a clear idea. The risk for them would be smaller, and there's a clear idea of what is the actual value, the potential value of a book. So E.L. James's 50 Shades of Grey is a very good example of how she started off as a self-published author who was later picked up by Vintage Books and republished and offered a very good publishing deal. Because once you're a self-publishing author, but you're proving through the readers' reviews that your work has potential, you're in a much better negotiating position with your publisher to have higher royalties and more control over the different uses of your work. So to summarize, how can authors make money from their creativity without selling themselves? I would argue that there are steps that they should be taking on an individual basis, but there's also a collective dimension to this that they need to be more involved in. So on an individual basis, the advice would be for every author to really think and be proactive and flexible and to be open to transitioning from one business model into another so that you can reap the benefits that come with both. But on a collective level, and especially having conducted my research with some of these unions and associations that represent the interests of authors in policy, I have realized really how important it is for individual authors to proactively engage and support the campaigns and the activities of these authors' organizations and lend their voice to these campaigns. Because if we look briefly, if we think about the European Union level and the Commission's proposal for a directive on copyright in the digital single market, for the first time, there is a directive that in Articles 14 to 16 actually there are provisions that deal with the relationship between authors and performers and the exploiters of their works. And this is in no small part thanks to very, very active campaigning from various types of unions, associations across Europe. So if individual authors add their voice and spread the message, they add their weight and credibility to these campaigns, which ultimately can mean that on a collective basis, the statutory framework that regulates contractual arrangements for authors could be improved and the discrepancy of the bargaining power between them and the exploiters can be minimized. So those are my concluding points. Thank you very much for your attention.